It was June 1944. The world was on the edge of collapse. Across the occupied towns and villages of Europe, church bells no longer rang freely, laughter had grown rare, and the iron grip of tyranny cast a shadow over millions. Families whispered in fear, resistance fighters clung to hope, and every passing day seemed to tighten the enemy's hold. But on one fateful night, the silence of Europe's darkened skies was shattered. Above the coast of France, the hum of engines grew louder, filling the midnight air. Out of the blackness came a fleet of American aircraft, their cargo not bombs or supplies, but men. Thousands of paratroopers, each one a piece of a vast gamble that would decide the destiny of nations. Their mission was simple yet impossible: to descend into hostile territory, scatter behind enemy lines, and tear open the gates for a liberation that had only lived in dreams. They carried little more than rifles, courage, and the burden of history on their shoulders. Each man knew the risks: flak tearing through the sky, chaotic landings, separation from their units. But still they leapt one after another into the void. Silk canopies blossomed above the French countryside like ghostly flowers blooming in the night. That single night would tilt the balance of the war. That single night would change the fate of Europe forever. The night sky over Normandy was heavy with clouds, yet underneath that veil the distant roar of engines grew louder, a sound unlike anything the quiet French countryside had heard before. Villagers who dared to peek through shutters thought for a moment that another bombing raid was upon them, but this time it was different. Instead of bombs, men would fall from the heavens, thousands of them. American paratroopers, carried across the English Channel in lumbering C-47 aircraft, were minutes away from their jump into darkness. They were young men, many barely in their 20s, clutching rifles, maps, and bundles of nerves. Each knew that within moments they would leap into the void, not knowing if they would see dawn alive. Some scribbled last letters to mothers and sweethearts, tucking them into pockets, knowing they might be found on their lifeless bodies before the sun rose. Inside the aircraft, the air was thick with sweat, oil, and tension. The red light above the door glowed dim, casting long shadows on steel helmets and strained faces. The drone of engines drowned out all but shouted words. They couldn't see the land below, only sense it drawing nearer with every heartbeat. Outside, the night was alive with flak. Bursts of fire lit the sky, rattling the planes, sending shards of metal into wings and fuselages. Paratroopers gripped the straps of their parachutes tighter, jolted with every impact, praying their aircraft would hold together until the green light flickered. Some planes did not. Men and steel alike vanished in sudden blossoms of flame, swallowed by the darkness before they ever had a chance to leap. And then it came. The green light. "Go, go, go!" The shouts rose above the engines as one after another men hurled themselves into the night. The slipstream caught them, ripped them into the vast emptiness, and their parachutes snapped open with violent jerks. In the chaos, formation dissolved instantly. Strong winds scattered men across fields, hedgerows, and marshes. Some landed in trees, hanging helplessly as the sounds of battle crept closer. Others plunged into rivers, drowning under the weight of gear they could not cut loose in time. But many hit the ground, rifles clattering beside them, breath knocked from their lungs, only to rise again and stagger into the dark French countryside. Confusion was everywhere. Units that had trained together for months found themselves broken apart within seconds. A lieutenant expecting to lead 30 men discovered he had only 3. Radio equipment was lost in the drops, maps soaked in streams or torn away in the wind. Yet amid this chaos, the paratroopers pressed forward. They were alone, often unsure of where they were, but their training taught them one thing above all: disrupt the enemy. If a bridge could be blown, blow it. If a road could be held, hold it. If enemy reinforcements could be delayed, delay them at all costs. The mission had been scattered with the men, but the spirit of it survived in each who drew breath and lifted his weapon. In those first minutes on the ground, fear was the companion of every man. The night was alive with sounds, the distant rumble of German vehicles, the sharp cracks of rifles, the echo of boots pounding on roads. Some paratroopers crept through fields, moving low among the hedgerows, waiting for a chance to strike. Others stumbled into firefights without warning, trading shots in moonlit orchards or shadowed lanes. The countryside of Normandy became a patchwork of sudden skirmishes, isolated battles fought by handfuls of men who refused to vanish quietly into the dark. For every soldier who was captured or killed, another carried forward, refusing to surrender the mission. Bridges were among the most vital targets. German reinforcements from inland would rely on them to rush to the beaches, and every hour they were delayed meant a greater chance for the invasion to succeed. In twos and threes, paratroopers planted charges, their hands trembling as they wired explosives under cover of night. The thunder of detonations rolled across valleys, collapsing spans of wood and stone into rivers, severing arteries of German movement. With each blast, the scattered soldiers could almost hear the ticking clock of history shift in their favor. Not all victories were planned. A group of paratroopers, lost far from their intended landing zone, stumbled upon a convoy of enemy trucks. Outnumbered and cut off, they ambushed it anyway, rifles cracking, grenades arcing into the convoy's heart. The trucks burned, enemy soldiers scattered, and what had been intended as reinforcements now smoldered wreckage in the road. Elsewhere, a single soldier crouched alone in a hedgerow, watching as enemy troops advanced cautiously down a dirt path. He waited until they were nearly upon him before opening fire, buying precious minutes with his life until others could regroup. The countryside itself seemed to conspire with the Americans. The hedgerows, thick with centuries of growth, offered cover to the scattered men. Barns and stone cottages became sudden fortresses, their walls scarred with bullet holes as firefights erupted. The people of Normandy, long silenced by occupation, began to notice the strange figures moving through their fields. Some villagers whispered prayers as they watched from cellars, others risked everything to guide paratroopers through the maze of lanes and ditches, pointing toward German positions with trembling hands. Liberation was not yet real, but for the first time in years, its scent hung in the night air. What emerged from the chaos was something greater than any battle plan. The paratroopers' scattering, though disastrous at first glance, became an unexpected weapon. Instead of a single predictable force, the enemy faced fire from all directions, sudden strikes that erupted and vanished, whispers of an army too vast to measure. Germans who expected orderly landings and concentrated attacks instead found themselves harassed at every turn. Roadblocks appeared where there had been none, bridges were gone where they were needed most, and rumors spread that thousands of Americans were already behind their lines, unseen but deadly. Fear magnified the presence of every lone rifleman, every tiny squad that refused to yield. By the time the night stretched toward dawn, the scattered paratroopers had become a storm. Individually they were exhausted, cut off, and often terrified. But together, across miles of fields and villages, they were a net thrown over the enemy's strength, tangling reinforcements, choking movement, and striking without warning. Their courage, multiplied by desperation, sowed chaos on a scale no plan could have scripted. In the distance, the horizon began to glow faintly with the coming of day, and with it, the invasion fleet that would soon crash upon the shores. The paratroopers had done what was unthinkable in the hours before. They had survived the night, and in surviving, they had torn holes in the enemy's defenses that would not be mended in time. In those fields, under the canopy of fading stars, the story of Europe's fate was being rewritten. Every man who leapt from the sky had become a thread in a vast, fragile tapestry of resistance. The cost was already staggering. Planes lost, men captured, lives extinguished before they could even touch the ground. But the effect was undeniable. Bridges lay shattered, supply lines severed, convoys burned, and fear gnawed at the enemy's command. The paratroopers had landed in chaos, yet it was chaos that carved the path toward liberation. They were scattered, but they were everywhere. They were cut off, but they were unstoppable. They were alone, but together they had begun to change the fate of Europe in a single night. The fields of Normandy were cloaked in an eerie stillness, as the first faint streaks of dawn painted the sky. But within that silence burned the defiance of scattered American paratroopers who refused to break. Exhausted, separated, and unsure of where their comrades had landed, they did what training and instinct demanded. They improvised. Groups as small as 4 or 5 men, sometimes only 2, crept along dirt roads and through hedgerows, searching for each other, gathering strength from numbers no matter how small. With every reunion came whispered plans, hurried decisions, and a renewed determination to carry out a mission that had been splintered by the chaos of the night. The Germans were already probing the countryside, moving cautiously in armored columns and truck convoys, trying to re-establish control. But the scattered paratroopers had transformed Normandy's quiet lanes into killing grounds. A handful of soldiers would crouch behind stone walls, wait until the enemy was within striking distance, and then erupt in thunderous ambush. Bullets cracked through the still morning. Grenades sent echoes across farmlands, and in moments, entire enemy units fell into confusion. Trucks lay burning on roads meant to rush reinforcements to the coast. Fields became battlefields, barns became bunkers, crossroads became fortresses. The Americans had no time to think of retreat. Their only thought was to hold, to bleed the enemy, to keep them guessing until the great invasion force stormed ashore. Crossroads became the most precious ground of all. A single dirt intersection could decide whether reinforcements reached the beaches in hours or were delayed by days. Small squads entrenched themselves at these vital points, digging shallow foxholes or crouching behind hedgerows, their rifles trained on the paths ahead. They had no tanks, no heavy artillery, no endless supplies, only their rifles, grenades, and willpower. When German patrols appeared, the air exploded in violence. Yet each time the Americans held longer than they should have, and the enemy found itself delayed, harassed, and confused. By the time dawn painted the land in pale light, these crossroads were littered with burned-out vehicles, spent casings, and blood-soaked earth, each one a testament to ordinary men accomplishing the impossible. Some paratroopers were not even sure where the beaches lay, but they knew instinctively that every enemy soldier they delayed, every supply line they severed, brought hope to those storming the coast. The invasion, though unseen to them, lived in their minds as a silent companion. They fought not just for survival, but for the faceless thousands who would soon be wading into the surf under heavy fire. Each minute they bought was bought with blood, but they paid without hesitation, because time itself was their greatest weapon. In the villages, clashes erupted between stone houses and narrow streets. A handful of Americans would take positions in upper windows, turning entire buildings into fortresses. German troops, expecting to roll through unopposed, found themselves bogged down in sudden firefights. Gunfire echoed through alleys, and walls cracked with explosions as mortar shells rained down. Yet even here the Americans held. Sometimes they slipped away under cover of smoke, only to reappear miles away at another key point, striking again. The Germans began to fight shadows, unsure how many they faced, unsure where the next blow would fall. It was not just the rifle or the grenade that turned the tide, it was ingenuity. Lacking heavy weapons, paratroopers turned captured enemy guns against their former masters. A machine gun abandoned in haste became a bastion of firepower on a ridge. Mines laid by retreating Germans were dug up and repositioned to destroy incoming reinforcements. A few daring soldiers even climbed into captured trucks, using them to ambush their own pursuers before slipping away again into the countryside. Every trick, every deception, every ounce of cunning was used to magnify their presence, until small squads seemed like entire battalions. The hours crept forward, and still they held. Exhaustion gnawed at them, hunger bit, and thirst dried their throats, but none thought of surrender. They were far from home, yet each man carried the weight of history on his shoulders. They remembered why they were there: to open the gates of liberation, to crack the spine of tyranny, to give Europe a chance to breathe free again. These thoughts burned brighter than fear, sharper than fatigue, and in the smoke and chaos of battle, they found strength. In one farmhouse, a squad barricaded the doors and fired from shattered windows until their ammunition ran low. Surrounded, they refused to yield, fighting until German troops withdrew in frustration, convinced more Americans were hidden nearby. In another instance, a single squad held a bridge through the night and into dawn, repelling wave after wave until engineers finally detonated charges that collapsed the span into the river. Such stands became legends whispered among the soldiers, proof that even in isolation they could hold the line. The Germans began to sense something they had not expected: hesitation. Their commanders demanded rapid movement to the beaches, but the paratroopers had poisoned the roads with ambushes, blown apart bridges, and turned each stretch of ground into a potential trap. Fear crept into the enemy's ranks, not just fear of death, but fear of the unknown. Every shadow seemed to hide an American rifle. Every farmhouse seemed to whisper of defiance. Reinforcements crawled instead of rushed, and with each hour lost, the paratroopers' mission was fulfilled in silence. And then the first rays of true daylight revealed the fields littered with parachutes, abandoned equipment and smoldering wreckage. For the Americans who survived the night, there was little chance to rest. Dawn only meant a clearer view of their enemy, and the battles raged on. They had no illusions of relief, no expectation of being pulled back to safety. Their purpose was to fight, to disrupt, to hold, even unto death if it meant the beaches remained open. The invasion had begun, though they could not see it. And somewhere behind them, across the grey waters of the Channel, ships carried armies that would soon flood the shores. Protected by the courage of those who had jumped into darkness, each squad, each soldier, each moment of resistance added up to something far greater than they could see. From the outside, they looked like scattered bands of tired men clinging desperately to scraps of ground. But in truth, they were the keystone of the invasion itself. By holding crossroads, delaying reinforcements, and standing against odds that defied reason, they gave the invasion time to breathe, time to expand, time to live. The beaches, once a gamble, became a foothold, and that foothold would grow into liberation. They had leapt from plains into uncertainty, and in that uncertainty, they found purpose. Improvisation became strategy, desperation became resolve, and chaos became a weapon. In the span of a few hours, those scattered men had transformed from isolated soldiers into the shield that guarded the greatest gamble of the war. By the time the first full light of dawn spread across the French countryside, the story of Europe had already begun to shift. The chaos of the night, the scattered drops, the confusion, the isolated firefights had coalesced into something greater than any plan drawn on a map. The German forces, expecting to sweep the countryside clean of scattered paratroopers, found themselves instead mired in hesitation, misdirection, and mounting frustration. What began as small, desperate skirmishes had ballooned into a web of resistance that wrapped around them, slowing their every movement, forcing them to second-guess every road, every bridge, every shadow. And in that fragile, precious window of time, the future of the invasion, and with it the future of Europe, shifted. The paratroopers had not merely survived the night, they had done something far more profound. They had unsettled the enemy, cracked open gaps in their response, and ensured that the landing forces rushing toward the beaches would not face the full, concentrated wrath of German reinforcements. For the soldiers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, the realization came slowly, almost imperceptibly, as dawn revealed their comrades emerging from hedgerows, barns, and orchards. Men who had been scattered across miles now gathered into ragged groups, bruised and weary, but alive. Their uniforms were torn, their ammunition low, yet their resolve only seemed sharper. Around them, the evidence of their night's work lay plain: smouldering wreckage, cratered bridges, bodies of enemy soldiers who had underestimated the will of those who fell from the skies. The enemy, meanwhile, struggled to comprehend what had unfolded. Their reports spoke of Americans everywhere, of villages suddenly erupting with gunfire, of convoys ambushed from the shadows, of bridges gone where they were needed most. The truth was that the numbers were not nearly so great, but perception often outweighs fact in the fog of war. German commanders, uncertain of the scale of resistance, hesitated. They delayed movements, redirected troops, and squandered precious hours. In war, hours are sometimes worth more than armies, and on this morning those hours belonged to the Allies. As sunlight grew stronger, the fields of Normandy bore strange and haunting sights. Parachutes draped across trees fluttered like tattered banners. Villagers, cautious at first, emerged from hiding places to find young Americans resting against walls, rifles propped beside them, eyes hollow with exhaustion, yet bright with determination. For the people of France, long trapped in silence under occupation, the sight was almost unbelievable. These men were foreign, strangers from across the ocean, yet they carried with them the promise of something unspoken but deeply understood: liberation. A farmer might offer bread or water. A child might point toward the nearest German patrol. And with each small gesture, the bond between liberator and liberated began to take root. And so, in fields and villages alike, the story of the invasion shifted from chaos to momentum. Where the paratroopers regrouped, they fortified positions. Where they encountered resistance, they struck hard and disappeared, only to rise again elsewhere. By now, word of the massive invasion fleet approaching the beaches spread in whispers among them. Though most could not see it, they felt it in their bones. The great wave of history was coming, and they were its shield. Every minute they held, every road they blocked, every bridge they demolished was another stone laid in the foundation of Europe's freedom. The Germans tried again and again to break through, but their movements came too late, too fractured, too uncoordinated. Each time they gathered strength, another small band of paratroopers struck, unraveling their plans with bullets and fire. It was as if the countryside itself had risen against them, its hedgerows and lanes haunted by an invisible army. The truth was simpler. 1,000 scattered men had refused to break, and in their refusal they had become far larger than their numbers. By mid-morning, the Germans faced not a scattered drop of disorganized enemies, but the tangible fear that their rear had been pierced, their flanks compromised, their response fatally slowed. And so it was that a single night became a turning point in a continent's destiny. The beaches, once a gamble that could have ended in disaster, now swelled with Allied troops carving footholds into fortress Europe. The paratroopers, exhausted and battered, were unaware of the full extent of their achievement. They did not see the armadas landing behind them, the tanks rolling ashore, the soldiers pressing inland. They only knew that they had fought with everything they had and held long enough for dawn to bring reinforcements. Yet history would remember them not just as survivors of a harrowing night, but as the vanguard of liberation, the men who changed the fate of Europe before most of the world even knew the invasion had begun. For those who lived through it, the memories of that night and morning would never fade. The endless roar of aircraft, the violence of flak tearing the sky, the jolt of parachutes opening, the fear of hitting the ground alone in enemy territory, all etched into their minds forever. Yet alongside the terror lived the knowledge that they had stood in the path of history's darkest tide and forced it to turn. They were not perfect, not all-powerful, not even always united, but in their courage, in their persistence, they achieved what armies greater in number had failed to do before them. As the sun rose higher, smoke drifted across the horizon, mingling with the cries of battle and the toll of liberation. Tattered flags were raised, villages embraced soldiers, and the long night of Europe's suffering began at last to crack open into dawn. The enemy's grip had loosened, and though years of war still lay ahead, the path toward victory had been carved. All of it, every step, every sacrifice, traced back to those men who had jumped from the night sky, who had fought in fields and villages unknown to them, and who had given the world the precious gift of time. The fate of Europe had not changed by accident. It had changed because ordinary men leapt into darkness with extraordinary courage, and in that single night they shifted the balance of the world.